just a reminder, we are streaming live on Facebook right now, and will be for all of our conference sessions this year. We won't stop believing that a few more people will keep rolling in. So we will wait 2 more minutes before we get started. Thank you all so much for being with us. And we will speak with you again very soon. 2 minutes and we'll get started. All righty, if all my panelists can turn their cameras on so we can see everyone's beautiful faces and gallery view to start out. I want to welcome everyone that is with us right now to our first session of our KY Policy 2021 conference. We are excited to share with you over the next 3 weeks, 3 weeks, several different topics pertaining to the 2021 General Assembly. If you're watching on Facebook Live, we would encourage you to join us on Zoom, as I do not believe I'll be able to keep up with any communication on Facebook. We will try to monitor both sides, but we are really trying to utilize the Q&A function here on Zoom. So if you are on Facebook Live, if you can toggle to the event page for this meeting, you can click the location and it should take you straight here to our webinar link here on Zoom, as we do want you to be able to engage with us as we move along. So thank you so much again for being with us. We hope that you will leave this webinar with a better understanding of the economic environment of Kentucky is currently in, what's led to this one-year budget proposal, the governor's proposal, and the implications of major budget debates we expect to happen during the session. So please join me in welcoming my colleagues. We have here, everyone here works for the Kentucky Center for Economic Policy, and we have our research director, Dr. Ashley Spalding. You can wave. Our senior fellow, Pam Thomas, and our executive director, Jason Bailey. So Ashley, if you are ready, you can get us started out.
Great, thank you. Natalie, and
maybe.
That moment there we go. Great, just making sure you can see my slide. Nope. Nope. Natalie, are my slides available?
I see them. But if you could speak up, it is a little quiet.
Great, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. I'll be describing the budget situation leading up to the current legislative session in which the General Assembly is crafting a state budget for the 2022 fiscal year. This chart provides an overview of the broad array of vital public services funded by our state budget. While in Kentucky, we typically have a 2-year budget, when COVID-19 hit last spring, the legislature passed a 1-year budget for 2021, which for the most part simply continued funding levels from the previous year. More than a decade of disinvestment in most areas of the budget have led to less funding for critical areas, including education and human services. And COVID-19 is putting additional pressure on the budget. These trends have important implications for well-being, economic success, and health in our state. Education is the largest portion of the budget, as you just saw, and it's one of the most important investments that a state can make. Yet all areas of public education have been hit by significant cuts over the last more than a decade. Funding for K through education through SEEK, the Support Education Excellence in Kentucky formula, that's core funding for our public schools. Per student, it's been cut by 16% between 2008 and 2021 when inflation is taken into account. Primary and secondary education programs not funded through SEEK have also been cut. In most recent budgets, there was zero funding for instructional materials such as textbooks and no funding for teacher professional development. Our Family Resource and Youth Services Centers, or FRISCIs, they have received flatline funding in 2021. And that means that, however, that when we compare current funding levels to those in 2008, that's actually a 15% lower when you adjust for inflation. And keeping in mind that that FRISCIs provide services for families in schools where at least 20% of students are eligible for free and reduced price lunches, and these are very important supports. And preschool was cut by 6.5% in the 2018 budget, and then flatline funded for 2021. These state funding cuts have put pressure on local school districts to either reduce staff and services or come up with needed funds on their own, or a combination of both. A couple of years ago, we surveyed school districts about what the impact of funding cuts and freezes had been between 2008 and 2017. And we learned about the harms these cuts are having on Kentucky kids in classrooms, including reduced student supports. And you can see some of the findings here on the slide. Reduced student supports, art and music programs being reduced or eliminated, and districts having mounting facilities needs go unaddressed, cutting staff, and being unable to provide raises. Funding inequities are also worsening as the funding gap between the poorest and wealthiest school districts is growing. We're just past the 30th anniversary of the Kentucky Education Reform Act, or KERA, and this graph shows we are nearly back to pre-KERA funding gap. As the pressure on local funding sources increases, the state's poorest districts are disadvantaged because even when they make the same property tax increase, it doesn't raise as much as in a wealthy district. Our investments in early childhood education are also underfunded. I mentioned the 6.5% cut to preschool in 2018 and flatline funded in 2021. We don't have full day preschool in enough districts, while full day preschool has been shown to be an important investment in terms of preparing kids for kindergarten and beyond. And childcare has been deeply underfunded as well, resulting in a big drop in the number of providers in recent years. These cuts make it hard for the state to reach its educational goals. And then COVID-19 has increased costs for schools as they work to provide education safely, whether it's online or in person or a combination of both. It's notable that federal aid, especially the relief package passed just last month, has provided significant support to Kentucky schools and also childcare amidst these challenges. Investments in education are critical to Kentucky's economic future, as well as the health of its citizens. research shows. Yet we also see cuts to the state's higher education system, which is making college unaffordable for many. State budget cuts to Kentucky's universities and community colleges over time have meant that these schools raise tuition in order to make up for some of the cuts. As shown in this graph, we therefore have seen the cost of higher education shift dramatically from the state to students. And we know that student debt is going up, and that is, especially during the pandemic, there's food insecurity and housing insecurity as well for students. Compared to before the Great Recession, Kentucky's public universities and community colleges are receiving nearly 35% less in 2021 in inflation-adjusted terms. As a result, they've reduced faculty and staff, cut programs, and reduced student supports. Also, amidst these budget cuts, more of the dollars for higher education in the state budget have been shifted to a performance funding pool, and then they're distributed based on metrics that include degree completion and a number of others. And this has resulted in several institutions receiving no performance funds, which has meant a funding cut. It's ended up meaning a funding cut from the previous year. And these institutions that received zero performance funds in recent years include Kentucky State University, which is Kentucky's historically Black public university, and institutions in the eastern part of the state, Morehead State University and community college campuses located in that area, where students may face among the most challenging financial barriers. During the pandemic, many Kentuckians have lost the health insurance they were receiving from their employer when they were laid off. This has contributed to a large increase in Medicaid enrollment of more than 255,000 people, or a growth of over 19% between February and November of 2020. Federal action has helped to mitigate the added costs associated resulting from the growth in Medicaid enrollment. Early in the pandemic, Congress enacted a 6.2 percentage point increase in its share of traditional Medicaid program costs, and that has temporarily shifted more costs from the state to the federal government. And while Kentucky has been paying a larger share of Medicaid expansion costs each year, each fiscal year since 2017, the 2022 budget will be the first since then that will not contain an additional increase in the state's share. And so Kentucky will now be paying 10% of the cost of expanded Medicaid without any further increase, while the federal government will pay 90%. Medicaid expansion has been a critical lifeline to those who lost employer coverage during the pandemic, and it's helped to keep healthcare providers, including and especially rural hospitals, afloat during the downturn. And I want to note, it's also helped to narrow the uninsurance gap between Black and white Kentuckians. Kentucky's human service needs continue to be deeply underfunded, which is particularly concerning in the context of COVID-19. These funding cuts over time, inadequate funding, has meant that there are long waiting lists for programs that provide support for Kentuckians with disabilities, including the Michelle P. waiver. And there's inadequate funding for the Department of Aging and Independent Living. There continue to be too few social workers to handle the state's large number of children in foster care as well. And Kentucky's local public health departments are also experiencing obviously added strain as frontline responders to the pandemic. Going into the pandemic, public health departments already had lost 34% of their workforce between 2012 and 2019 due to repeated rounds of budget cuts and also added required pension contributions. Although the governor provided $159 million in federal funds to assist the departments, and that was last year, more resources are especially needed in the pandemic, and also in light of potentially devastating additional increases in their required pension contributions. I'll say a bit more about the pension issue. It's an important issue in the state budget, not just for public health departments, but all quasi-governmental institutions in the Commonwealth, which include regional public universities and the domestic violence shelters and community mental health centers, among other organizations. So because of House Bill 1 passed in the special session of 2019, these quasi-governmental organizations will be required to increase their contributions for their employees' pensions from 49% to 85% of payroll, or else buy their way out of the system altogether. Last session, the one-year continuation budget froze the contribution level at 49%, which gave these agencies another year to decide. So in order to hold off potentially crippling increases in the pension contributions in the midst of a pandemic, it's up to the General Assembly to act again. Meanwhile, although Kentucky's criminal justice costs have been rising as incarceration continued to grow, we're now seeing the first decline in incarceration in many years. And this graph shows the initial projections last year on number of people incarcerated compared to what's happened since then. This is a combination, or there's a combination of reasons, but a lot of it has to do with the governor's 4 rounds of commutations, resulting in 1,881 people being released due to concerns about public health in jails and prisons during the pandemic. And those places have been shown to be hotspots for the spread of the pandemic. And so the governor's commutations are a big part of this, but there are other factors as well. Do want to say that we expect those numbers and related costs to go back up if the state doesn't move forward on needed reforms. This overview has covered just some highlights of budget cuts and pressures which are felt across state agencies and throughout Kentucky. Before we hear from Jason Bailey about what's in the governor's budget proposal, we'll hear from Pam Thomas now about the revenue situation.
I think that you should be able to now see my slides. Is that correct?
We can, thank you.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about revenues and what to expect for this session. But before I do that, I would like to set the stage for where we were going into the session and some other things that will impact our revenues. So overall, things just haven't been as bad as initially predicted with state revenues, and that's been because of several reasons that I'm going to talk a little bit about. So that's a bit of good news for us as we progress through the pandemic. But a couple of things to keep in mind are that this recession has been really different from most recessions because the economic impact has been very unequal, with people making low wages or working multiple part-time jobs, particularly women, bearing most of the brunt of the lost income and reduced hours. By and large, what has happened during this recession is that higher income people and people who can work from home have been able to maintain their paychecks and haven't really sustained many of the hardships. And the impact on our revenue receipts is that because of this, we haven't seen as much reduction as we thought we would. And a couple of the strong areas are the individual income tax, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute in a little more detail, has been sustained pretty well. And also our sales tax revenues have been pretty good. And that's primarily because a lot of these folks who normally travel a lot and maybe spend money out of state are staying home and they're buying stuff that is subject to our sales tax. What this does, though, is it makes the impact of the recession a little bit more difficult and nuanced to understand. If you just look at the stock market and the GDP, which are a couple of things that we tend to look at when we want to know what's happening nationwide economically, those indicators are both doing well and are expected to rebound and grow over the next few quarters. And if that's all we wanted to look at, we'd think we were well on our way to a rousing recovery. But if you look at the devastating impact of the recession on so many Kentuckians who have built up huge debts because they haven't been able to pay their rent and maybe haven't been able to pay their electricity bills, and even when those people go back to work, a lot of folks in Kentucky were marginal to start with. They were living paycheck to paycheck. So if they return to similar jobs with similar wages, what has happened over the recession is they've amassed quite a bit of debt and there are no extra resources for that. And so it's going to take years for a significant investment for a true recovery to occur for everyone. Another thing I want to mention before I move on to the 2020 receipts is that the additional $600 a week that unemployed people received under the CARES Act was a vitally important lifeline for those people and their families, but also for our state economy. A couple of things that $600 did for us. The initial payments that people got allowed them to do things immediately and to keep their family and keep food on the table and pay their rent. But then that extra $600 sort of extended over the rest of the fiscal year. It allowed those people to maintain those things over the rest of the fiscal years, but it also propped up our receipts through the general fund, which helped to stave off what we were expecting with regard to state revenues. So let's take a look here at where our state revenues come from. And these are from 2020 receipts. And you can see that the income tax, individual income tax, is still the largest contributor to our general fund. It was diminished by the tax cuts in 2018 and 2019, but it does still remain our strongest tax. And the fact we have an income tax is one of the reasons why our revenues were not as devastated as those of other states. The fact that we have a good variety of taxes that help to supply the revenues for our general fund. The other thing is that if you look at most of the states that don't have an income tax, they either have a very robust tourism industry or they have extractive industries that contribute to their general fund. And of course, in this pandemic, the tourism industries were hit very, very hard. So the fact that we have an income tax and a sales tax was really to our benefit in this recession. Our second largest tax is the sales and use tax. And as I noted previously, the collections have remained strong. And there's primarily two reasons. Kentucky was on the forefront in enacting legislation that would require marketplace sellers and marketplace facilitators to collect and remit sales and use tax. And that segment of the sales tax has grown substantially. It was growing really fast before COVID, but after COVID hit, when people were staying home and buying online, it really kind of went through the roof. The other thing that has happened is that big box stores have really led, stores like Target and Home Depot and Lowe's, and that has been propping up our sales tax, but a lot of the smaller businesses, local businesses, Main Street businesses that have had to shut down, the revenues from the big boxes have more than made up for what we've lost from those other sources. The third line down is corporation and OLET, and this has been a declining source of revenues for our tax base for quite a while, and the tax cuts in 18 and 19 just made that even worse. The primary tax I want to mention in the other category is the bank franchise tax, and that tax is going to be shifted. This is the last year banks are going to be paying it. After this year, they're going to be paying the corporate income tax, and that shift is going to result in a loss of $30 to $60 million in our general fund. So another thing to keep in mind here is that this graph shows that our general fund revenue is eroded from 7.3% of personal income in 91 after the tax increases to support CARA, the Kentucky Education Reform Act. It's reduced down to 5.7% of personal income in 2020. And that may not seem like a really big percentage, but that erosion is equivalent to $3.2 billion less money that we have if we had simply maintained the same ratio. So now for just a bit of context before I move on to the actual revenue estimates, I want to talk a little bit about where we were going into the 2020 session before COVID hit. And where we were there is that the revenue estimates that were projected by the consensus forecasting group before the session were the weakest that we have seen since the consensus forecasting group exists, which was 1996. And the reason that those projected receipts were so low was, again, the tax cuts of 2018 and 2019. COVID happened then, of course, in the middle of the session, which prompted the one-year budget, and with very, very little information about what the potential impact would be, how long it would last, they revised the estimates downward. And as I noted previously, the federal fiscal relief prevented our economy and our tax receipts from going into a tailspin. And we did actually end 2020 with more receipts than were expected, but they were still less than the very weak receipts that were expected by the consensus forecasting group. So although we're breathing a little easier because it's possible for us now to move forward without the need for cuts to balance the budget and to continue current programs, we're still in a situation where our revenues fall far short of what we need to make the investments that we need to make. We continue also to run a large structural deficit. And what that means is it's like we don't take in as much money as we spend. And so we have to find, the General Assembly constantly has to find other sources to balance the budget. And one of the things they do that with is fund transfers. And although less than the past, the governor's proposed budget still relies on over $83 million in fund transfers and another $10 million in lapses. So essentially, those are monies that are by statute or other directives supposed to be used for other things, but instead they go to the general fund. So now moving on to the forecast for this session. The 2020 forecast was done on December 4th, and that was before the last federal fiscal relief package passed. And so it assumes that there is no federal fiscal relief, and it also assumes that the COVID was going to spike this winter, which would result in additional restrictions and business closings throughout the winter. Despite these assumptions, the forecast projected 126 million more in revenues than the current budget was based on, and an additional 55 million more than what they projected back when they did the first set of projections. So despite the fact that they assumed no additional federal fiscal relief and there would be further COVID impacts this winter, they still projected very, very modest growth. And so here's what it looks like. This is a slide from the OSBD presentation to the A&R committee last week. And you can see by individual tax here that they project growth and modest growth in most areas, with a continued decline in both cigarette tax and coal severance tax. And I want to note that if you look at the very bottom line there, the other line, you'll see that when we get into fiscal year 22, it's a reduction of 12.8%. And then you see an increase in the corporate and LLET, and that's because banks stop paying net franchise tax and start paying the corporate tax. And as I noted earlier, that results in a net loss of either of $30 to $60 million from the general fund overall. And so this is also a slide from the Office of State Budget Director's presentation before A&R. And what it shows us is where we are now 6 months into this fiscal year in comparison to the estimate, and what we're going to need to happen in each of the taxes in order to make the estimate at the end of the year. And what this shows is that we're on track to meet or exceed the estimate. Revenues will likely be better than anticipated because, as I noted a few slides back, the estimates were based on additional federal fiscal stimulus, which has since been passed, or I mean, the estimates were based on none, and since then we have had it. And that's going to help to prop up our economy for sure. It's probably, without additional relief, not going to be at the level that we saw under the CARES Act because the payments to individuals are less and there's no direct benefit for the state. But it's also more likely, given the results of the election, that we will have additional federal relief. And so the last thing that I want to talk about before I turn it over to Jason to talk about what's in the governor's proposal is the one-time money that the governor has identified and has spent on projects initiatives. Jason will talk about the expenditures in more detail. So the money comes from an expected end-year balance of $49 million. So what the governor is assuming is at the end of this fiscal year, there's going to be a balance of $49 million. Which will probably be from reduced expenditures. And then, as I noted a couple slides back, there's an increase in the revenue estimate for what the 2021 budget was based on of $126 million. Then the other thing that has happened is because the instructions about how the CARES Act state money could be used, they were able to use $319 million of CARES Act money for expenditures that would otherwise have been spent using general fund money. So that frees up some general fund money. And then the last thing that happened is that part of the CARES Act, or maybe it wasn't the CARES Act, maybe it was the earlier one, but in any event, the federal government agreed to pay more. So Medicaid is a program that's paid with part state, part federal money. And Kentucky, for our regular Medicaid program, has about a 70% match. So the federal government pays about 70%, Kentucky pays about 30%. And what the federal government did is increase the amount that they were paying, that they agreed to pay for Medicaid. And that increase is expected to last through July 31st of 2022. In any event, what that did is freed up some more general fund money that could be used for one-time projects. And so with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to our Executive Director, Jason Bailey, who is going to talk about the governor's proposal.
Great. Thank you, Pam, and good to be with you all today. I am sharing my screen now. And the bottom line of what I think you've heard from both Ashley and Pam is that we have these long-standing problems with our revenue stream in Kentucky that has forced budget cuts and underinvestment, especially since the Great Recession. But because the federal government has stepped up in a pretty significant way, and will step up more starting next week when the new president is inaugurated and the new Congress gets going, and to provide relief to states in the economy. We actually have a kind of unique, at least in recent Kentucky history, opportunity to provide some relief and reinvestment in this budget. It won't be something we can do in future years, but at least for the next year, there's a chance to for this budget to be a better tool for helping people get by and helping us get out of this recession in the best, strongest, and most robust way we can. So I'm going to go over some more details about that, specifically having to do with the governor's proposal, which came out last week, that he laid out to the General Assembly. The bottom line of the extra relief that we receive is that we have $613 million in one-time money. And the governor is proposing to use that primarily to do three things. One, provide relief to individuals and to businesses. Second, protect our existing public services, and in some cases, begin to reinvest in those services that Ashley has shown how they've been cut so much. And then make some one-time investments that can help stimulate a faster and stronger, more widely felt recovery. So I'm going to go over those sort of three ideas. First, in the area of relief, we know that hardship is widespread among individuals and families, especially those low-wage workers who have been more likely to be laid off in this crisis. And we know that there are many small businesses that have been hit hard, particularly in certain service industries. Many are teetering on the edge at this point. So the governor proposes what I think are some important short-term relief efforts. One is $48 million in unemployment benefits to people who've been left behind or left out of unemployment aid. The second is $240 million in targeted aid for small businesses and for nonprofits. And then the third, and this is not so much an immediate area of relief, but it's a really important part of our relief infrastructure that has been sorely neglected, and that's our unemployment insurance system, to restaff that system, which under the previous governor, about 90 staff were taken out of 12 regional offices that could actually help people get unemployment benefits. It would restore that, as well as update our 1970s era computer system that uses an obsolete programming language and is a major reason that people have been delayed and denied getting unemployment benefits. So putting the money needed to replace that system. So to give a little more detail, kind of the first two parts of that. In the area of unemployment insurance, which is kind of the left column of this slide, what the governor is talking about is first $1,000 payments to people who've waited more than 2 months for benefits. And we know, again, because of this really outdated computer system, as well as just the extreme volume of claims with all the layoffs and the understaffing that the system had going in, people have had to wait too long, months in many cases, for tens of thousands of Kentuckians. And this would provide those people with $1,000, a single $1,000 check, and then $400 checks to two groups of people who make very little in unemployment benefits. Kentucky's unemployment benefits are as little as $39 a week, if you can imagine. And you may be one of those people trying to get by on that. It's just not enough. One group that would get an extra $400 is there was a program created by the federal government in the fall that gave people an extra $400 a week. The state paid for part of it. It happened for about 6 weeks. But the way that federal program was designed, people who made less than $100 in state benefits got nothing from that program. So this would go back to those people and give them an extra $400. And then for people who just get less than $176 a week now, it would also give those folks an extra $400. So pretty significant lifeline, at least, to tens of thousands of people. Thankfully, the governor, this part of the governor's budget, he is doing using the existing, the leftover or the remaining federal CARES Act money. So the General Assembly does not have to approve this part of his budget. This is going out the door now and will be really helpful to these folks. The second part of this aspect is money that would go to small business and nonprofits, which the governor introduced as a separate bill with an emergency clause. So it would happen immediately if the legislature would do it. And it would do two things. First, $220 million for small businesses. So Kentucky businesses with less than 50 employees who've had a loss of revenue could get up to $20,000 based on how big their revenue loss was in any quarter. And it would be available to certain businesses that are in certain sectors or certain industries that have been really hard hit because of the way in which the virus has limited our face-to-face activity. So you can see the list here, restaurants and bars, yoga studios, gyms, roller skating rinks, bowling alleys, hairdressers, nail salons, those sort of small retail shops, those sort of businesses that really need the help. And then secondly, we provided $10,000 grants to, again, small Kentucky nonprofits, less than 50 employees, those that serve primarily populations that have been most impacted by COVID-19 and the recession. So low-income communities of color, immigrant refugee communities, people with disabilities, and so forth. So this is, again, a separate bill that he's asking the General Assembly to pass immediately. They have stalled this bill, though. They're not moving it before they recess this week until February. The next thing the governor's budget does is protect existing services. And this is actually would be the first budget since before the Great Recession in 2008 that we did not cut, that does not include budget cuts. And that's pretty significant in that context. In some cases, it includes some reinvestment in things that we have cut in prior years, as Ashley described. There's 76 more social workers to deal with the child welfare crisis. This was proposed last year, but then put on hold because of the virus and the recession. Some modest increases to K-12 funding and different parts of K-12. There's also federal money, though, coming to K-12 schools in the new relief bill that was just signed. That will be very helpful. There are raises for teachers, for classified employees. There's 1% raise for state employees. State employees have not gotten raises in 9 of the last 11 years. This is not a huge raise, but it is a raise like they have not seen before. An increase in higher education funding, which was mentioned before, has been cut over and over again. This is the first increase we've talked about in quite some time. And then more monies for some other areas like public health, slots for people with disabilities, and so forth. The third theme of what the governor laid out was this idea of making some one-time investments with this one-time money that would help spur a faster recovery. And there's a few items of that. I'll just talk about two. One is $50 million in last mile broadband grants. This is a really important proposal in that, successful broadband efforts, especially rural broadband efforts in other states, have been, essentially about the public funding of system building in the last mile, which means that creating fiber and connections, high-speed internet connections directly to household and businesses. Even in our own state, we've seen that works under the Recovery Act. Back in the Great Recession, money came to the People's Rural Telephone Cooperative in Jackson and Owsley County, and they used that to build a high-speed internet system in those counties that has been very successful. And that's the kind of success that could be replicated with this kind of money. There's also $100 million for school construction. Kentucky has about $7 billion in unmet school facility needs. The facility needs are worse now than they were 10 years ago, as we have not had the funds to reinvest. We also have fewer people employed in construction than we did 20 years ago. And so this is an opportunity to both put people to work as we come out of this recession in a sector that needs it, as well as provide safer and more modern learning environments for kids. So there's a couple of examples of there's other pieces in here as well that would be some one-time spending to help spur the recovery. And then, so the budget does those three things: provide relief, protect public services, and make one-time investments. But it also does include responsible debt payments. And that's something we haven't always done in Kentucky. You folks know, observed this the last couple of decades, especially when it comes to pensions. But it's also the case that the debate over that has been in some cases exaggerated and implied that we can't do anything as a state because we have all this debt. And that's not true either. What we need to do, such as in the case of pensions, is make the actuarially determined contribution every year. And if we do that, we will chip away at the debt and we will be fine. This plan does make those contributions, both for the teacher system as well as for the state worker pensions. It also increases the amount provided on behalf of the quasi-governmental organizations like health departments and community mental health centers that was mentioned earlier, and changes the formula for those payments in a way that really protects those organizations from more budget cuts, as well as puts more money into the pension system at the same time. The governor's plan also includes $101 million toward paying down our federal unemployment loan, on top of $150 million in CARES Act money he already used for that purpose. That pays down about half of that loan. There's an automatic mechanism where that loan will be repaid through an extremely small employer tax. So this is not really a crisis for our budget or for businesses, but the governor did put some money toward that, as well as $100 million in our rainy day fund. Now, in a crisis like this, using the rainy day fund to protect existing services is completely justified. But in this case, we don't have to, because of the way that this federal aid is coming into the state and really help the money. So we can put a little bit aside as the governor proposes to do. So that's at a high level what the governor proposes. The General Assembly, has not yet acted on their budget. They are passing a shell budget that essentially just puts it into conference committee so that they can work on it in the interim between now and February 2nd. But at least the ideas in that, the basic ideas that I just laid out in the governor's budget have been pushed back on by the General Assembly. It's not clear what they're ultimately passed, but we definitely there are some themes emerging. The governor's talking about using the money to help struggling people and businesses, reinvest in public services, make these strategic one-time investments, even while, again, responsibly addressing the debt and even putting a little in the rainy day fund. What we're likely to see from the legislature is a more austere budget that doesn't do many of these things, that instead probably puts even more money into the rainy day fund, or perhaps goes beyond the actuarially determined contribution for pensions, or pays off all the unemployment loan. And, in the case of pensions, we have a long-term liability that we need to chip away at every year with the actuarially determined contribution. But going beyond that, does little to reduce the liability in terms of, and when you compare it to the size of the liability, but it can hurt the economy. It can leave people without relief who need it, and it can make for a slower recovery. In the case of the unemployment loan, if we put even more into that, that just means corporate taxes are going to be a tiny bit lower 2 or 3 years from now. But that's all corporations, including, Walmart, Amazon, and Lowe's, that have seen record profits in this crisis and really don't need a tax break. So those kind of ideas about austerity and prioritizing that over relief and stimulus are very concerning. And then when it comes to the rainy day fund, in case you haven't looked around, it is raining in Kentucky when it comes to the lives and livelihoods of families and communities. And it's actually a torrential downpour. And so it's both morally responsible and economically wise not to ignore the rain like this person is, and for government to actually step up and provide relief, and not be this person who is just not being aware of what is around them. We've also heard that there may need to be more in the rainy day fund because the forecast won't work out. we need to be more conservative. As Pam mentioned, the forecast assumed there would be no additional federal aid beyond the CARES Act that passed in the spring. And in fact, we got a significant package at the end of December. And not only that, as Pam mentioned, the Biden administration and the new Congress are working on and will propose, I think tomorrow, another aid package that will be substantial and is very likely to pass given the outcome of the Georgia Senate races. So it can definitely be argued that the forecast is actually conservative. Last slide. No, I'm sorry, 2 more slides. Just to point out, everybody knows this, but the reason we need relief in this crisis is that the need is huge and widespread. The recovery has stalled. This graph only goes through November, but we were down 108,000 jobs. We probably lost jobs in December. We know that low-wage workers, workers of color, and women have been more likely to be laid off in this crisis. And all the indicators of hardship, from rental debt to number of people who are hungry, are really high. So there is a moral responsibility to get money out the door and into people's hands. And finally, just to reinforce, we do have an economic responsibility as well, especially as people get vaccinated and get out of this crisis. We need a recovery that's robust and widespread. And in a recession, consumer spending drops, business investment drops, and government's the only entity that can step in with spending and investment to spur a recovery. So if we have a budget, if we can have a state budget that protects public sector jobs, gets people to relief, and puts people to work in things like school construction, they spend that money, it multiplies, and in some of that spending, we can create a kind of an infrastructure with things like broadband internet access that can result in a more robust recovery. So with that, I will stop, and I'm going to hand it back to Natalie.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you all for being with us again. This is our Q&A time. So if you do have any questions for any of our panelists, we would love to hear them. I am going to kind of check out the Facebook again just to make sure that we don't have anything going on over there. But please use the Q&A function. Thank you so much for being with us. And also, I do have the opportunity to allow you to speak. So if you have a question that you don't want to write out, I would also be happy to just let you talk through it as well. So let me know if you all have any questions. I'm not seeing any right now. Jason, while we're waiting for questions, could you just tell us what the next step is in the process? I know that it is absolutely not straightforward as far as just from here to we have a budget. So right. Could you tell us a little bit more about that process?
Yeah, so the governor proposed his budget last week. That's just a proposal. Now the legislature begins its work. They have decided to not pass separate budgets in the House and the Senate this year, but to pass essentially a shell budget this week and get it into what's called a conference committee, which means that there are members of the House and Senate that will meet and come to a consensus budget that the legislature will then pass. They set the calendar so that they go into recess after today until February 2nd. And then when they pick up February 2nd, and they have to be done by March 30th. But they will want to pass a budget that they can override a veto of the governor. The governor can line out and veto the budget, meaning he can pick particular things in the budget to cross out and send that back to the legislature. But if they pass the budget in time where he has 10 days to veto, and if they pass it early enough, they can then override his veto, which is certainly what they are going to want to do. So we'll be completely done with this process by March 30th, if not sooner. But the time to weigh in with the legislature on what you think a budget should look like, what you think the priorities should be, is now, because that conference committee will start meeting this week or next week. And they to put together what they're going to end up voting on.
Thank you. We do have some questions popping up now. The first is, what is the duration of the special UI benefits?
Yeah, so the federal government passed, I think the president signed on December 28th or 29th, the next federal relief package, which extends the special unemployment benefits. So that includes benefits for people who are self-employed or gig workers, people who've used up the 26 weeks of state benefits and are getting an extra 13 weeks that's now been extended, 11 more weeks of federal benefits, as well as $300 a week extra on top of what you get normally. That has all been extended until March 14th at this point. So right now people have these expanded unemployment benefits until March 14th. Then they will end unless Congress and the new president act to extend those. And every indication is that the relief package that they propose tomorrow and pass probably next week or the week after will include extended and expanded unemployment benefits. So I think we can be hopeful that folks will continue to get those benefits beyond March 14th and hopefully into the summer or beyond, or until this crisis, ideally until this crisis is well behind us.
Thank you. And is there anything in the proposed budget that speaks specifically to affordable housing? And of course, this is to our whole panel, but.
I'm not aware of anything housing specific. Trying to think, and my co-panelists may be able to help, but I'm not aware of any special allocation for any housing related thing. There is obviously some of these relief measures like the unemployment help is going to help people afford what they can do, afford housing. There is in the federal relief bill more money for rent relief, and there's utility relief as well from the last bill. So there is federal money coming into the state to help with those sort of issues. But as far as the state budget, I'm not aware of any new appropriation.
Thank you. And in addition to getting relief from skipping pension costs, are quasis getting other support to help pay for increased costs related to COVID? They do so much important work. They do.
I think it depends on the type of quasi-governmental agency. I think the health departments are getting more money for sure. There's a $12 million additional allocation, plus there's federal relief money coming in that is going to go directly to the health departments for help with, sort of vaccination as well as other work that they're doing through this crisis. So the health departments for sure are getting extra money. In the case of some of the agencies like the domestic violence shelters, their pension costs should actually go down compared to what they were before under the governor's proposal because of this complicated new system that he's proposing. That is actually a bill from a Republican legislator named Jim Duplessis. That's a good bill, and it would actually, for most of them, actually reduce their pension costs. So that frees up a little money. There's more money for higher education in this budget, so that will help those regional universities and community colleges. Plus, they're also getting some federal money. So for the most part, there is. There's not enough money in this budget because we're not talking about new revenue at the state level to truly be able to sustainably reinvest. And we're going to be back here again in January dealing with a tough and tight budget, chances are. And so these longstanding issues are still going to be there. But at least for this year, we can do more than we've been able to do before.
All right. We have a question in the chat. In real terms, how important do you feel a successful vaccine distribution is going to be for our economic recovery over the next year?
Well, I know others can jump in here too, but it's absolutely essential, and the quicker the better, right? I mean, obviously, the more people we can get vaccinated, the quicker we can get them vaccinated, the quicker businesses can reopen, the quicker people can go back to work and to some semblance of normality. So, it's one of the really important things about the new president's administration, that they have a plan to really mobilize, almost in a World War II style scale, of getting it out and getting it into people's hands. We know that nationwide it's been a little slow so far. So we need to do better as a country. And there is more money, thankfully, in the relief bill that finally passed and was signed to help with distribution. But we're going to have to do more.
Thank you. I'll throw this one and maybe one more question, then we'll kind of wrap up here. Is there any interest in tax changes during this legislative session?
Pam, you want to take that one?
Everybody
the only bills relating to revenue that have been filed so far are further exemptions and cuts and breaks. So I think that maybe we will see a comprehensive revenue proposal introduced from someone on the Democratic side, but I think the only thing that we've seen so far that has actually been filed. But the thing to keep in mind about revenue bills over the last few sessions is that, generally speaking, we don't see what's going to be proposed. It isn't that they're introduced in bills that we can see and process and talk about and communicate about. What happens is that when they're in the conference committee, they add or do their revenue changes. And so the way that that works is then the bill comes out of that. A lot of the provisions are things that we didn't see before then. And then when it comes out, it's either an up or down vote in the chamber. So there's very little room for interaction or any way for anyone to talk to people about what's being proposed.
Well, Pam, while you're speaking, we had a follow-up that's kind of in the same line. In addition to increasing the corporate tax rate, what are some other positive ways that we can generate revenue?
The very best thing that we could do is to go back to a progressive tax rate in our income tax, which means that the more income that you make, the rate gets higher, and that would address the regressive nature of our tax system, where people who have lower amounts of income now pay more as a proportion of their income in taxes. So going back to a progressive income tax and increasing the upper rate would be a great way to start. Then reducing some of the deductions and credits for higher income people would also help to address the regressive nature of our tax structure while generating significant new revenues for us. We could expand the base of our sales tax to include more services, and we could adequately tax. You all have heard that there is the issue with instant racing machines now, where the Supreme Court has said that at least one form of those violates the Constitution because it doesn't, or violates the law because it doesn't constitute pari-mutuel wagering. And right now, Kentucky doesn't tax those sufficiently at all. And not anywhere near what other casino gaming or slot machines are taxed at. And so we could generate quite a bit more money because those are, and it is an issue that I think the General Assembly will address. And so one of the things that we could advocate for is to tax those on par with the casinos in other states. Did you want to add anything, Jason?
Just that I think Natalie is going to put up a link to our website at the end of this, and there is a revenue options report that we produce every year or so. There's one from 2020 that includes all the things Pam mentioned and some other ideas as well. If we were to get serious as a state about raising new revenue, there are all the things she mentioned and more that we could adopt that could help us out.
All right, well, we have 2 minutes till 2. We do have a couple more questions, and we will try to answer you all after this. And so we just want to thank you all for coming. 2 questions are kind of in line with what we want to follow up with. Is just that what are the most persuasive talking points to encourage our legislators to provide protection to Kentuckians rather than put out a really conservative budget? And then the next question after that was, because of supermajorities, is there any way to influence spending priorities? Phyllis, I am with you on feeling that question very deeply as far as what are options for influencing the priorities in our state. And our communication director is, well, not communication director, previous communication director, now deputy director, is on the call. If she has anything she would like to say about some of those talking points, we can connect with you directly as well, because that is rather specific, but I will allow her to speak if she would like to. But we will also, you know, just kind of end up in this session by saying that, you know, our budget, I'm sorry, I said that and then lost my space altogether. Kentucky's budget is our value statement for our state. Where we spend our money is where our hearts are. And so we do ask you to call or email your state representatives and senators and let them know how Kentucky's budget can best serve its people. That is really the number one thing that anyone can ever do to influence our legislators, is to call them, to email them, to get in touch with them. I am dropping some links in the chat now for everyone to get a hold of. And in those links, we have, first off, kypolicy.org/governor's budget increased funding. So if you want more information, a little bit more of the analysis that we went over today, if you want to dig into that a little deeper, that first link is to our budget analysis. The next is just to the legislature.ky.gov. That is the LRC website. That is where you can find tons of information about how to get in a hold with your person or your legislators. The next one is exactly that link, Find My Legislator. So if you need to figure out who your legislators are, your senators, your representatives, that link is for you. And then the last one is kypolicy.org/Commonwealth Primer Kentucky. That is our budget primer. So if you want to learn more about the budget process itself and how that works in Kentucky, you can access that through that link as well. I want to leave just a minute. We are at 2:01, but I do want to open it up if my panelists have anything else they would like to add before we close out. And then I'll do the housekeeping things and we'll be done. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you all again for joining us. We really appreciate your time today. Again, you can go to kypolicy.org for continued coverage of our budget as we have, you know, new ones coming. If you are registered before this event, you will receive an email with access to today's slides and a short survey in the next couple of days. And so we appreciate you for registering and being with us. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this program, we have 3 more sessions in this year's KY Policy Conference. This Friday is Race, Equity, and State Policy, how 2021 General Assembly issues affect Kentuckians differently based on race. So that will be this Friday at 10:30 a.m. The following Friday, January 22nd, we will be hosting Reforming Sentencing Policy in Kentucky with Dr. Ashley Spalding, who is on this panel. And then the last, on the last Friday of the month, January 29th at 10:30 a.m., we will be talking about economic security in the age of COVID-19. So again, thank you so much for coming. We will try to email those who did have questions that weren't answered, but you can contact me directly, Natalie at kypolicy.org, if you do have any additional questions. And we hope to see more of you for the following 3 Fridays. So thank you so much for being with us, and we'll see you again.